Welcome one more day to Space in Harmony. And a person asked me to speak more deeply about the seals and implants. So I'm going to respond with this video. In the other video, the Spanish version, there have been much interest. And we have to go to the ancient past in order to understand the roots of the seals of consciousness and the implants, which are of different kinds. We will be seeing this subject today and the following day, and maybe later weeks. Now, before going into this subject, keep in mind 8 steps. I will leave a link in the blog to a document. If you remember, last week I was referring to several steps used by the Nazis and the communists and religions, even the CIA, in order to enforce social compliance, social obedience, and control the human will. Now these are 8 steps, which I'm going to number, and you have to establish the connection between these steps and the seals and implants, the subject that we are going to touch. The first is isolation. People are enforced to be isolated from others and from themselves by means of social distancing and other means. Then we have the monopolization of perception. In other words, leading people to perceive reality in a certain way, generating the so-called consensus reality. In the third place, we have leading people into exhaustion or even states of suffering by means of psychological torture or even physical torture, something that we see in our society in different means used by the system. In the fourth place, we have threats. If you don't behave as I want, I'll punish you. And this is connected to the fifth step, which are occasional indulgences. If you behave as I want, I'll give you occasional rewards, tiny moments of pleasure. The sixth step is to give a sense of omnipotence and omniscience. The state knows everything. Follow the politicians and scientists and religious leaders, because they know perfectly how reality works, and they are connected to true knowledge and true divinity in some cases. And as we see, following the established authorities is like following the blind that leads the other blind into the ditch, following a pack of wolves to be devoured by them at the end. The seventh step is degradation. You are an animal, you don't know anything. Obey those who are in charge of the animals. You are just a sheep, obey your pastor. We find that in many domains, science says that we descend from the ape. And they even say that we don't have a spiritual soul, which in many cases it's true, because our society is full of psychopaths which lack conscience and therefore a spiritual soul. They have an animal soul, even a Luciferian reptilian soul, as we will see later. In the same way, religion says that we are just sinners, rags, dirty rags, and therefore we have to obey the Lord God, who knows the rules for how to behave in this world. And finally, we have enforcing trivial demands, things that have no sense, such as wearing face nappies and muscles, which are completely useless. Now in Spain we are living a very difficult situation because they want to sink down the economy. The economy is completely sunken, and they are generating a sense that the pandemics are growing here. And I suspect this is because in September there is a a demonstration against the government, which is a government like those of Venezuela. They want to turn Spain into a Venezuela. And they now want to enforce a new lockdown so that people don't complain about anything. And this will bring many problems economically, so people will have to find a way of getting by, a different way of getting by. Now, this is just a tiny part of what is really taking place. Humanity is being enslaved from very ancient times, and by means of a very definite plan. And this is what we have to understand, because this is key in the question of seals of consciousness and implants, which are physical, psychological, spiritual. But we have to go back to the Garden of Eden in order to understand this deeply. Remember that ancient myths speak of a great chaos, and as we see in Genesis 1, the earth came to be disorganized and desolate. Then we knew the reason. In Proverbs 9 we read that Sophia, wisdom, which is really the serpent beings that had certain wisdom, built up her house, raised her 7 pillars, mixed her wines, her genetics, killed her victims, and laid the table for eating and sacrificing. So now we have identified a group of fallen architects, fallen Elohim, which are the so-called serpent gods, that step out of true reality and began to generate their own tree of knowledge of good and bad, which is really a physical reality where beings die, where beings chase each other, and that's not natural, that's not in tune with the primordial reality, where everyone has everything. Now, in order to reorganize the chaos generated by those serpent gods, the existential verb, which is comprised of different architects, Yud He Vav He Elohim are different angelic architects, even from the natural kingdom, they form a new humanity out of the dust of Adama. Adama is the astral land, it's not this physical earth. And they wanted to educate that humanity in order to reorganize the chaos in the astral world. So they had to impregnate that humanity with different impulses from such world. There was no Adam to till the land of Adama. So Adam was formed and he was given the breath of understanding, the Nishmat Haim, the divine intellect, we might say. And Adam became a Nefesh Chaya, a living soul, which are really light beings. They were not physical. Some would say angelic beings or Cherubim. But they were placed in a dimension called Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden. There they could explore different astral realms, planets, and star systems. And they had to interact with other species in order to reorganize the 4 elements, which in the tale are represented by 4 rivers that came from one river, the river of Eden. Those 4 rivers represent 4 types of creatures. And the architects wanted to give that humanity the chance to interact with different forces. This is why the tale says it is not good for Adam to be alone. Let's give him an appropriate helpmate. The translation should be a contrary helpmate. That is, a body, a psychic body, in which those humans can work to till the land and generate certain energies. And the tale goes on saying that the architects presented different creatures from Adama, and from the earth, to see what name Adam gave them. Now, keep in mind that those astral creatures are represented or symbolized by the Masarot, the 12 signs. They represent different astral carnal psyches. And when we are told that Adam gave them names, it doesn't mean he said, look, there is a bird or a dog. In Hebrew, to give a name is to impregnate something with an essence. So Adam gave the Adamic consciousness to those species. And the expression, and that was the name he gave them, is Ushemo, which curiously has the same numeric value as Mashiach, Messiah, anointed with consciousness, in order to rule over the passions, because that's the aim for Adam. That's what the architects wanted. To be anointed is to have the right to rule. Remember how the Elohim wanted Adam to rule over the beast of the earth, the air, the water, which is not really in accord with love, but we'll see that this is the problem. Because Adam did not find the appropriate or contrary helpmate. Adam gave name to the species. Those species became Adamic, but the divine intellect could not govern the carnal astral passions, and the tale says that the existential verb, the architects of nature, put Adam into a deep slumber, into a deep sleep, tardema. So here we have the first seal of consciousness, and even conscience, because Adam could not discern what was the right choice. And we are told that from one side of Adam, the architects took the woman and they put flesh. We know it wasn't physical flesh fully yet, but we know it was a different state in which humans became more carnal, so to say, even though they were not fused with the physical world yet. And the woman was flesh of my flesh and bones of my bones. So it was the body of Adam. And the man was the spiritual consciousness, which was asleep. And we are told that man and woman were naked, but they didn't know it. So they were unconscious of their new state of being, which was very precarious. And the story says that the woman heard the whispers of Nahash, translated as the serpent. But what is the serpent? We have to understand that the serpent is associated with the tree of knowledge of good and bad. Adam had been given a command, which was not to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and bad. Humanity could eat from the tree of life and other trees, receive teachings, because that's the meaning of eating from reality, but not the reality of the tree of knowledge of good and bad, which is a physical reality full of duality. And it was actually the reality generated by the serpent gods, the fallen Elohim, known as Samael, the angel of death. Curiously, in Matthew 13, we read that the enemy that planted the tares in the Garden of Eden was an ECHTROS ANTHROPOS in Greek, an enemy man. This was the teaching of the Master. So it was not a higher god, it was a man which ruled over the animals. Samael, the angel of death, because living in a physical world implies dying, something which was not necessary for humanity. They could eat from the tree of life, and as Philip says in his Gospel, the tree of life produces a spiritual mankind, whereas the tree of knowledge produces animals. And the genetics of the tree of knowledge had been left in the Garden of Eden, and Adam had been put in the Garden of Eden. So the architects knew this, and somehow they implanted the capacity for free will in the Adamic species, and this was a problem because they had the seal of consciousness. They could not perceive reality as it was. This is the difference from true reality, where we have no free will, because true loving will has no conditions, and we have no choice. We love because that's our nature, and we cannot escape true reality when we are in tune with the primordial source. The problem is when we have a body with astral passions, and this was the whispers of the serpent, and even the astral carnal intelligences that were imprinted in the genetics of humanity. Humanity had two genetics. The genetics of the Nahash left by the fallen architects, and the genetics of the original 12-fruit tree of life, the 12 strands of the DNA, the divine DNA, the original DNA of humanity, primordial humanity, which was meant to be developed by the Adamic species, to become more spiritual and organized chaos. However, as we know, those first humans in the Garden of Eden listened to the whispers of the serpent, to the carnal passions, and they ate from the tree of knowledge of good and bad. And for this, many try to blame the serpent, but remember how Apostle Jacob said that God, where Elohim does not tempt anyone, it's the own passion. Well, the own passion is part of Elohim, the forces of nature, and it's part of our own egoism. But those first species of humans did not have enough spiritual development, because they were put in a almost animal state before they ate. The woman saw that the tree of knowledge was good to eat, good for the sight, and also good for acquiring wisdom. Good to eat because it brings pleasures that are not in the spiritual world, pleasures such as sexuality, and there are forms that we cannot see in other places, but it also brings a different wisdom, the wisdom of the serpent, which is dark. Now, we have to keep in mind that the angel of death, Samael, had a very dark intention, which was to reproduce his world, to keep it going, and therefore it puts tricks into their bodies they make with their genetics. And the serpent gods use a feminine dark energy known as Lilith in order to reproduce the psychological and physical impulses. Lilith comes from Laila, which is darkness in Hebrew. In India they speak of Lila, the cosmic game of illusions, because this is a world of simulations, false pleasures. And that was the trick of this world. But the most dangerous trick was the wisdom of the serpent. And this is very important to understand, because it has to do with spiritual sexuality. The angel of death wanted to incarnate serpent souls from the previous destroyed worlds and give them new vessels. So the genetics of the serpent were in the garden because the angel of death wanted to use the new humanity as a vehicle for fallen souls, to mix the light from the divine and make use of it to reproduce the own genetics of the serpent. So it was a trick, an evil trick, even though the serpent genetics are both good and evil, the tree of duality. Sometimes serpent energy is pleasant. There are many Kundalini awakenings which are deceptive because they are pleasant and they are used by yogis and occultists in order to generate subtle bodies. That's known as Kundalini yoga, and receive certain wisdom, certain souls, which are really the souls of the serpent beings that have no bodies. And this is why they use the 7 chakras to ignite the pineal gland and receive certain wisdom. Keep in mind that the spirituality of the serpent is the spirituality of Lucifer, the carrier of light, the vehicle of light, which is not light itself. And remember what the Master said: you are the light of the cosmos. So you are not carriers of light, you are not animals. You are the light of the cosmos when you are connected to the primordial source, the primordial father, not the father of lies. And this is what many don't understand. But let's realize what took place when humans ate from the tree of knowledge, because they were expelled from the Garden of Eden, the beatific state. They felt naked for the first time, and this was because their perception changed. They began to have fear, which is connected to the genetics of the serpent. And this fear made them hide. Hide where? Maybe below the earth, or in some cave. And man was told to eat bread with the sweat of his forehead, because the mind had become slower, the spiritual consciousness had been asleep, but now it was even more asleep. As for the woman, it was said that she could give labor in pains, because in this world, beings reproduce by physical sexual means, and that implies having pain. And in my opinion, this is because the type of souls that incarnate in this world came from previous worlds. In many cases, they were reptilians from the world of the serpent, and they were larger. So when they began to reproduce themselves through new bodies, those bodies were not prepared to give birth to different types of souls. Remember, there was a hybridization, a mixture of 2 different types of soul: the soul of the serpent and the soul of Adamic species. As for the woman, it is said she was called mother of the Hai, the living. She was called Hava, Eve in English, because she gave birth to a new type of carnal humanity that was really hybrid. Because the mind and body of Adam mixed up with the genetics of the serpent. And the serpent had her own mind, which came from Samael, and her own reproductive energy, which is Lilith. Because Lilith wants to reproduce the fallen souls, the reptilian souls, through human bodies. This generated contrary impulses, contradictory passions. That was the origin of homosexuality and lesbianism, or even pedophilia and zoophilia, and many other different impulses, which belong to a new type of humanity known as Cain. Now, when they were expelled from the Garden of Eden, there was a cherub with a flaming sword put by the architects to keep them away from the tree of life. This means they did not want those humans mixed up with reptilian nature to become immortal, because they had become like one of the serpent gods. And you shall be like the Elohim, says the story. So humans became a sort of serpent gods, but they were not immortal yet. So the architects kept them away from eating from the tree of life. And the cherub is really the brain that has to be harmonized. This is why there was a new nature, a new humanity that was completely dual. It was known as Cain and Abel. Cain is the carnal psyche, and Abel is Havel, the breath of spiritual consciousness, the seed of conscience. And this is even explained by the Master. In Matthew 13 we learn that the son of Adam is the good seed, but that seed was killed by Cain. Cain killed Abel. This is the reason why in 1 John 3 we read that Cain came from the evil one. Well, Cain was the son of the serpent, the angel of death, and this gave rise to a new Luciferian humanity, because the first Lucifer was Samael himself, but he wanted to reproduce his system, putting some humans to dominate over other humans. Actually, I think this is the beginning of spiritual cannibalism, because humanity began to cannibalize a spiritual conscience, but also carnal cannibalism, because humans were expelled to the land of Eretz. When they killed Abel, they went from Adama to Eretz. So they lost the perception of the spiritual realm, the astral realm, and they became more carnal. I think many of them are those found in caves, where there are evidences of human sacrifice and cannibalism. However, there was a spiritual humanity that arose, because the man knew the woman, Adam knew Hava, the spiritual mind knew the body, and gave birth to Seth, a humanity that became the source of spiritual lineages, such as the lineage of Enoch, Prophet Enoch, who walked with Elohim, because the vibration of his soul raised the vibration of his body, and that humanity became spiritualized. They left the earth, they were taken, literally. This was accomplished by issue for Yeshua, as some say today, 2,000 years ago, which was even more difficult, because to do that in these bodies is even more difficult. This is why we call him the Master. He was fully connected to the Father from this reality. And I think that he even didn't lose his physical body completely, because even though it was murder, I think it was somehow kept by some Elohim, or he was able to reabsorb that physical body later on in his spiritual body. But that's a speculation. Now we have to realize in which stage we are. We have Cain and Abel within ourselves. There is treason, there is a Judas within ourselves. So we have to be very careful not to go out in the field, because Cain killed Abel in the field, the battlefield. We have to raise our vibration and become Seth. Remember that the field of death is known as Aseldama, which is the field where Judas hung up himself when he sold the Master by 30 pieces of silver. And I understand that when we are in the spiritual path, there is a struggle between the truth and the lie. But we have to move even deeper, so that we are not deceived. But in order for that to take place, we need to eat from the tree of life, to open the seals, the 7 seals, and dissolve all the serpentoid implants. And we have to eat from the 12 fruits of the tree of life. So we have to add the divine purpose, conscience, and the will that allows us to fulfill that. The will to understand, the will to connect with others. The following day we'll see different types of seals and implants. But before going into those subjects, let's understand that we are a threat to this world, to the world of the serpent, and therefore there are many who try to kill us, who chase us. But they show everything in display. In 2001, there was a Luciferian ritual, which was the controlled demolition of the Twin Towers. It was not a terrorist attack. And this was a way of telling humanity that some duality was brought down. The true Helix DNA, the voice of the serpent, has killed evil in many people. So they have generated a collective psychopathic humanity which is completely asleep, and many of them are rulers. And this is why there is so much chaos and turmoil in the earth. There are many psychopaths. For instance, let's remember what we read in Isaiah 59. They lay serpent eggs and they weave spider webs, and those who eat from the serpent eggs die, and those who are smashed, from them come vipers. This is because many have viper souls. Even Yeshua himself said to the Pharisees, "You are vipers, a brood of vipers. You are sons of your father, the accuser, and the father of lies, which was a murderer from the beginning." Who was that father? A fallen man, and that was the angel of death, as we saw. And he is still planning to destroy us. Remember the teaching given in Matthew 21, the parable of the vine keepers, the murderers. The parable says that there was a father of a family who put a wall in a vineyard, and he sent some vine keepers. Later on, he sent some servants to see how was the harvest, but the vine keepers stoned one of the servants, beat the other, and killed the other. Later on, the father sent new servants, but they suffered the same destiny. But eventually he sent his son, thinking that they wouldn't do anything with him. But in this case they took him out of the vineyard and killed him as well, because he was the heir, the one who was going to inherit the whole vineyard. And I ask you, who is the father of that family? What is the vineyard? Who are the vine keepers? Who were the servants? And who is the son? Many Christians would say that the son was Jesus Christ, that was killed and resurrected 2000 years ago, and we have just to believe that to be saved. But those of you with discernment know that the son is a collective son, that some of us are really part of that collective son. We come from a primordial source, and the Father wants us to bring light and help many souls to be liberated. The Son has a body and a head. The Master issue was connected to the Father fully, and he became part of the head, a neuron of the Father, we might say. Here we are playing the role of the body. So remember the role that we have. And in this world there are many forces trying to destroy us, so we have to be very careful with the grounds in which we step. And remember also the passage of Isaiah 13. They come from far off lands, from beyond the heavens. Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, the existential verb, some would say Jehovah, and the instruments of his wrath to destroy the whole earth. And cry because the day of the existential verb, the day of the Lord, some say, is near. And desolation will come by the hand of El Shaddai, the Almighty, some say. And every hand shall be broken and every heart shall be obscured. Obviously, the religious mindset cannot understand these words. They worship a Lord that punishes. But we are told about a movement of existence, cycles that bring instruments of wrath, because there are negative beings that try to control humanity. And they have planted their own fallen genetics. And nature has blind mechanical cycles, which are painful and destructive. Opening the seals of consciousness means becoming aware of all this. But we have to remove certain implants as well. Anyway, for today we have enough information. Thank you very much for listening. If this was inspiring to you, please give thumbs up. Leave comments if you wish, that contributes to promote the channel. Tell me what you think about all this. And let's remember that we can only eat from the tree of life by feeling that unconditional love, which is not based on free will, and feels a life which is not modified, is full of vitality, even transforms the impulses of the serpent, using the light, the primordial light of conscience and pure consciousness. And this leads to a deep serenity that has nothing to do with the blissful states given by the Kundalini. Only this can raise up our vibration, moving us beyond a struggle, beyond duality. So let's keep eating from the 12 fruits of the tree of life and blessings of primordial light.